All right, well then let's get started. Let's see, Ryan, do you want to introduce yourself first?
For sure. My name is Ryan Wellington. I've studied a few things, philosophy, theology, psychology. Right now I'm trying to work more in law. I run a YouTube channel called Intending Truth, and that's kind of a succinct summary of where I'm at right now.
All right, and then my name's Thomas. I run the YouTube channel In Search of Prometheus. I have a Substack of that same name and do a few other things. Everything will be linked in the description. We were planning to do a few of these. We're going to do this one on 12 Rules for Life, and then in the future we'll do 12 more rules, and then we plan to do one on Peterson's newest book, We Wrestle with God, as close as possible to when it comes out, as is practically feasible at the time. So, something to look forward to. And eventually we're hoping to round it out with his fourth book, his original book, Maps of Meaning, whenever I get around to finishing that. So, it's a work in progress. All right, well, our first item. Ryan, do you have any, general thoughts on Peterson? How did you discover Peterson? How did you first learn about his stuff? What was your kind of initial impression? I've got a bit of a story, but I can let you go first on this one.
For sure. I think Peterson is one of the most intriguing people that's alive that I've ever studied and thought about and read. I've seen his events 4 times, and I've met him twice, and he becomes more intriguing every time I meet him and talk with him. I first discovered his books because of the political controversy surrounding him and his debate on campus that he was having with forced speech and forced pronouns. After that, I was intrigued by his work and his advice and suggestions as a psychologist. Since I've been reading his work, I found his ideas to be valuable and in line with much of the philosophy and ideas and values that I hold as well. Yeah, that's kind of a brief snippet of how I began to discover Jordan Peterson and how I've enjoyed his work so far.
My own story, so I actually found Peterson quite interesting because I'd heard about him quite a bit through kind of starting in undergrad. The first person that was really telling me about him was I took a Philosophy 101 course in, I think it was my senior year. Yeah, it was my senior year of college. And at this point, I was already pretty well versed in philosophy, kind of just in general, kind of from my own studies and everything else. This was just to fulfill credits, because they told me I still needed a fine art credit, and apparently Philosophy 101 counts as a fine art. So it's like, all right, cool, I'll have some fun with it. But my professor ended up being a Catholic. I don't want to necessarily label him Catholic philosopher because I'm not sure if he was specific. I can't remember specifically if he did philosophy kind of in a religious sphere, but he was a philosopher and he was a Catholic, and that obviously influenced things. And this was before I'd converted, so it's kind of funny that. But he's the one that originally told me about Peterson as someone who's like, you would really like his style. I think you'd really understand the things he's trying to say and appreciate them, and you should check him out. And he didn't actually first recommend 12 Rules for Life. He recommended that I check out Peterson's Genesis lecture series on YouTube. And I didn't do it for the longest time. It was actually probably about a year later that I finally did check out his Genesis lectures. And I kind of concur with you that I just found them absolutely fascinating. For me, it was kind of a paradigm shift in how I understood the world when I listened to him talk, which kind of sounds grandiose, but I think it is true and warrants saying, because for me, I'd always been very rational in my thinking. I'd always almost been kind of empirical in how I viewed the world. I didn't give credit to a lot of things that I now give credit to, and listening to Peterson talk about, in that case, Genesis and the Bible, really helped me connect some things about these deeper levels of meaning that are in, these older works. And, his very Jungian approach to philosophy, for whatever reason, maybe it was just the time and the circumstances, helped connect some dots for me and kind of my own understanding. So yeah. I'm very thankful for him in that regard, because he very much helped me develop as well. Which kind of leads into my next question. So I've had this debate a few times online and in person. What exactly is Jordan Peterson in terms of discipline? I mean, obviously, he's a psychologist by discipline. He was a practical and clinical psychologist, and, from all accounts, very good at his job in that regard. But in terms of his more academic writing and getting outside of the pure academic psychology, because he did some of that, but then he has other stuff that's a little harder to classify. So something like 12 Rules for Life, would you consider it philosophy, psychology, self-help, whatever that is? You know, he gets labeled that. In my experience, self-help is usually just a kind of a derogatory term for, you know, pop philosophy to kind of pretend like it's a lesser variety. But I think, you know, we both appreciate Peterson. I think we've both been, I just talked about how I've been deeply impacted by his works. From what I've seen, that also applies to thousands, if not tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, if not millions of other people have been also deeply impacted by his work. So, yeah, what would you consider him in that regard?
For sure. I think first, for a lot of people, he's an unexpected political phenomenon for a lot of people.
That's very true. I didn't even mention the political side of things, but yes,
right, yeah.
You can't really escape that.
Yeah, I think one of the reasons that he's so unexpected for a lot of people, as well as my experiences of him, is that I think that he consciously tries to evade and escape categorization in different ways. Because I think his thought process is that if he becomes categorized into some sort of broader category of things, is that people are going to use that to put into a box and then also dismiss him and preemptively dismiss what he's going to say because they know a priori they disagree with whatever that category is, or they know a priori they're going to agree with it, whatever that category is. So I think his first strategy, in my experience of him, is to evade categorization. And I think he does that really well, which also, I think, adds a level of clarity to his ideas, but also some vagueness and intrigue, and gives you maybe an unexpected anticipation of what he's going to say next, because it could be very surprising, at least for the times that I've seen him. So I think Peterson is unexpected. He's unpredictable on some level, but also still predictable on his values and authenticity and kind of the rules that he lays out for us in different ways. He is a political force. He's become that. I don't know if he intended to become a political force. I think he meant to be a force that would help people with their lives as a psychologist, offering wise rules for life and suggestions. For me, I wouldn't put him necessarily in a category of like self-help, insofar as I would see self-help as a category of people trying to independently and almost in an isolated sense improve their lives just by reading books. I think his books compel people to be part of the community, to be involved. And because of that, I see him as a wise advice giver who doesn't fall into the isolated category of self-help for me. But yeah, what about you?
Yeah, I pretty much agree with that. I think I definitely agree that he intentionally avoids categorization. I mean, he states explicitly it's in the next one, but in 12 More Rules for Life, you know, one of them, if I remember correctly, is avoid ideology or something to that regard. You know, do not trust ideology, do not trust those prepackaged labels. And yeah, I kind of, ironically, I don't think I've ever connected that to necessarily that he says that, and then he specifically himself tries to avoid it. The only label I can really think of him that he's adopted himself is conservative, but at the same time, that's such a kind of ambiguous and kind of malleable concept, especially in the American, and I realize he's Canadian. I mean, American kind of in the more pan-Western, not European sense. Another vague sense, but you kind of know what I mean. Kind of that expanded Anglosphere. We share the same culture to a degree enough, where yeah, he kind of identifies with that conservatism, but whatever that might be, which seems to be evolving at a constant pace, evolving at a certain pace, and he seems to even be influencing that evolution to a certain degree. So yeah, he does seem to very much avoid that categorization. I think it also is in line with some of his predecessors intellectually, because I kind of consider Peterson, he's kind of in a line of thought that includes, I'd say the main other figures in his kind of domain philosophically are Nietzsche, Freud, and Jung. Obviously he references Jung quite a bit because I think he's the most direct of his intellectual ancestors, but obviously you can't really talk about Jung without talking about Freud, because they kind of defined each other, both in what they agreed on and also what they disagreed upon. And I strongly believe you can't really talk about either of those two either without talking about Nietzsche, because, I mean, Freud especially, you can find direct lines of thought from Nietzsche to Freud. And I think the thing that really categorizes all three of them, with Peterson as well, following in later, but we have their complete works. They're not adding to it, so we can kind of define them a bit more. Is they also have that very hard to define aspect to their writings, where Nietzsche's like, is he a philosopher? Is he, one of these many other things? With Freud and Jung, it's like, are they psychologists? Are they philosophers? I personally like to describe both of them as literary critics. They've just kind of understood that the most important narrative that people tell is the ones we tell about ourselves. And not even in the methodological sense necessarily, but sometimes in the individual sense. So they kind of, actually, I don't think either of them really did too much empirical psychology. Peterson has, but I don't know if they did to the same degree. But even when they aren't, where they aren't, it blends that line of psychology and philosophy and self-analysis and all these other things, because I think there's a certain aspect of studying the human psyche that goes beyond all those kind of rigorous boundaries. Mm-hmm. And I think he does, kind of, like I said, kind of live up with that tradition. Mm-hmm. Changing gears a little bit, I think one more thing before we actually get into kind of more of his work specifically is I want to talk about him and religion, because that's another topic he touches on a lot, both in the more modern sense of the more established religions, but also in the mythological religious sense. Because again, like Jung and Freud and Nietzsche, he talks about the mythic narratives a lot. But there's also is that conversation now, because I mean, it's no secret, we're both Catholics, both converts to Catholicism, and he talks a lot about Christianity specifically because, again, we're also Western, so that makes sense. Even if we were all secular, you can't avoid that conversation. Without kind of pointing that in a direction right now, what are your thoughts on Peterson religion right now? Because it's complicated. I kind of want to hear your opinion before I go off in another direction, if that's the case.
For sure. Whenever I see a video or a podcast where Peterson is talking about, for example, in the title, his belief in God or his religion, I usually will click on that thing because I'm curious to know what it is.
They're usually interesting, at the very least.
Yeah, and I think that's an area where he has successfully evaded a lot of categorization. He seems Christian, but maybe not Christian in a more traditional sense. At least he seems to talk a lot about the Bible and have values that are within the Bible or traditional Christianity, but I'm not sure he's really adopted that term for himself, so I don't even know if that's how he would accurately describe himself. I know that his wife recently, this last Easter, converted to Catholicism, and I'm sure that has impacted him and their family. And I know he's intensely interested in the Bible, as well as its psychological layered of meanings in it, historically, and what it means in these archetypes and these developments for society in general. Most recently, when I saw him in Oklahoma City, I heard him talking about his belief in God. At one point, the questioner asked him, "Do you believe that Jesus of Nazareth literally died and rose again from the dead?" And Peterson responded, "I think that's the simplest answer," because the questioner was trying to get him to answer yes or no and pushed him on that as much as he could, and that was Peterson's final answer to him. My interpretation of that was, yes, I think he believes those historical events actually happened, because I think he's answering as a scientist, parsimony, the idea that the simpler answer is the one that we should probably default to, and we don't need to extrapolate explanations beyond necessity. That sort of Occam's razor sense. So I think he's toward Christian theological understandings of the world, but I actually don't know, and I can't say for sure, and I don't want to mischaracterize what he would say, even though he seems to avoid that question, try to escape categorization.
I definitely think it is an interesting question. It is one that would have been on my list. If I could sit down with him right now, that would have been one on my list, probably to repeat ask him, because I do think that's an important one. Obviously, that gets down to the very factual matter of the truth of Christianity, or what whether he believes in that truth of Christianity. But I also think, I'm trying to figure out the best way to kind of encapsulate all these thoughts, but taking a step back for real quick, I think we can both agree that there's a lot of different ways you can define Christianity and kind of figure out the fringes. I think for a quick definition, I think we can both agree that kind of historically and academically, like Nicene Creed affirming sex and people kind of fit the definition of Christianity, right?
Yeah.
It's kind of a quick down and dirty way of doing it. Like if you agree with everything in the Nicene Creed, that's pretty much you're a Christian. So that would be something I would like to ask Peterson what his views on that is, because the actual bodily resurrection, that's a part of it, but there's some other things in there, because I'm almost interested. Peterson has traditionally viewed religion through that very, like I said before, mythological lens. And don't mean it in terms of myth as in didn't happen, mythological in terms of narratives we tell about ourselves. So specifically, you can kind of refine that to, he talks about religion through a psychological lens, which makes sense given his background. And I'm almost curious if part of his reluctance to, outright affirm any belief or lack of belief in that kind of, say, going back, like that Nicene Creed level of Christianity, is because while we both agree if you affirm everything in the Nicene Creed, you're Christian, there are many aspects of Christianity that are not encapsulated with that creed, particularly when it comes to the psychological level. So that makes me wonder if perhaps, I think if you take the totality of his public discourse and everything, I think we both agree he's more or less aligned himself with a lot of Christian beliefs, kind of metaphysically, ethically, morally, in a lot of different ways. I've almost wonder if he hasn't, even though that layer is kind of in place, if he hasn't gone back to look at that more even basic level of just, do I think these things actually happened, to a significant degree for him to want to make that claim one way or another. Because again, that answer you just talked about kind of illustrates that. It's like, do you think Christ died and was resurrected? Well, I think it's the most likely solution. That obviously isn't something you'd hear in church, right? Like, that's not a positive affirmation. That's a scientific, I think it could have happened based on the information I know. So he'd probably say the other things about, the other aspects of the factual, the things that need to factually be true for Christianity to be true. So I wonder if that's kind of the thing that's holding him back from adopting that label. I'd be very interested to know. But the other point I want to make with that, because I do find this interesting, is I also think from his perspective, he doesn't think that matters as much. Okay. And I kind of want to know what you think about this, because obviously, most Christians would say, well, if you deny or have serious doubts about the actual resurrection, that kind of, that's the linchpin of Christianity. Like, nothing else matters if that didn't happen. But the impression I almost get from him, though, is it almost seems like Peterson agrees with kind of like a meta reality of Christianity, as in like the monomyth itself manifests itself in Christianity. Like, it's such a perfect myth structure that it's true almost regardless of the fact pattern that actually gave birth to it. In this sense of like, what does Christ represent? He represents the union of the infinite and the particular. He represents the divine and the mundane. There's this meta, again, the monomyth, this meta story of the death and resurrection, the literal, the harrowing. He goes down into hell, comes back with divine wisdom, all this stuff. So I want to know what your opinion on that would be. If he comes out and says that, like, I haven't even thought about the factual matter regarding Christianity, but everything else about it seems to be so true that I consider myself a Christian. Do you consider that a Christian? Like, what would you classify that as?
For sure. Oh man, yeah, that's a really good question. I feel like it's also challenging. I think, like you said, most churches will kind of use the most essential basic element of assent to belief to refer to the Nicene Creed. But at the same time, most of those churches are also going to say someone who says they believe in the Nicene Creed, but also goes off and lives a life that doesn't correspond to Christian values, is going to be Christian in name only, and maybe not even that. When you're describing Peterson and his focus on the truth of myth and his use of the word true in his books, which is a very interesting use of the word true. It's not just the factual sense, which we traditionally expect from science, right? Mm-hmm. It's not just that events A, B, and C happened, and you can measure it using this data, some sort of like carbon dating, or else like some sort of phenomenon in physics, whatever it's going to be. You have a specific instance or a specific definition of fact in science. And he's not using that, even though he's a scientist, which makes it intriguing, right? So we're beyond science to begin with. We're stepping into something that's philosophical and or theological at that point, right? Because we're stepping into truth in a domain that extends beyond just scientific truths. And when he's using that, it seems like he almost has the inverse categorization of what it means to believe something to be true, as opposed to what people believe now, which is that epistemic belief, and you've talked about this before too, epistemic belief matters first and actions matter later. It seems like he wants to say actions embody truth on a level that short propositions don't. So it's like this extension from reality and action and being, as he would probably say, that extends into the proposition and not the inverse. I know you have thoughts on that too, so I don't know.
Yeah, I do. I don't want to derail too much right now because it's something we've talked about the degree before. I just want to know your thoughts on it for this purposes because we need to move on a little bit to some of the other material in the actual book and stuff. Sure. But I just wanted to kind of discuss it because I do think it's important for us. I think it's important to understand Peterson's work, and it's also would be one of the kind of the number one questions I'd like to ask him if I ever did get the chance. Specifically, I'd kind of want to ask him, do you see a difference between factuality and truthfulness on a, definitionally? Like, is it a Venn diagram? Is there overlap? Can you have something that is true but not factual? Can you have things that are factual but not true? Obviously, there's the middle overlap. There are things that are factual and true, of course, but it's kind of those fringes I'm interested about and how we define that, because I think you are right on the money about kind of how he's talked about it. So, interesting discussion. We might have to have more in depth at a later time.
For sure.
But moving on, there was one last thing I do want to cover a little bit about him generally before we get to the book itself, and that's kind of talking about his behavioralism, and this actually is kind of a good segue into that, getting away from the sociological, mythological perspective to kind of the individual again. This kind of looks more at his clinical practice. Would you consider Peterson like kind of a behavioralist from the psychological perspective? Because, we both have degrees in psychology. Oh, you're working on one, right? Do you have an actual one yet?
I'm working on my second one.
Okay, I was about to say, I thought you had another one. But yeah. So, when I'm saying Peterson's behavioralist, I think it's very apparent in a lot of his practice and kind of the stories he's told about his practice. Is he really emphasizes the idea that, if you do certain actions, your emotions and your thoughts and your consciousness will then, and your subconscious as well, will kind of later then embody the results of those actions. So, kind of want to know your thoughts on that, kind of his style. Do you think that's a fair categorization? Kind of the best one I could think of is, I think he's used it a few times, but in one of his lectures, he talks about how he's like, if I get someone in that's depressed, I'll ask him a few questions like, do you have, are you educated to a level that is suitable for your intelligence? Do you have a close interpersonal friend? Do you have hobbies that you engage in, or anything that lets you, engage yourself in a productive manner? Do you have, an artistic expression that meets your desire to create artistically? And he's like, if I go through that list and they're hitting, and they're telling me no on the vast majority of them, he's like, well, then no wonder that they're depressed, because their life is depressing. So what are your kind of thoughts on that? Do you think that's a fair interpretation of how Peterson views his kind of psychological practice and psychological evaluation of people, that he kind of falls in that behavioralist mindset or behavioral doctrine.
Yeah. When I was listening to different lectures of his, and he was recommending changes to behaviors and steps to take, I noticed that a lot of his suggestions to people seem to fall within almost that behavior sense of, I guess, behavior modification and conditioning on a certain point. And so he's wanting to adjust people's behavior in order to affect their internal life and what's going on. At the same time, when I'm seeing his psychological suggestions for his clients, and then I'm also like reading his books and contemplating his advice, some of those things that he's saying, especially with regard to like meaning and this interior perspective that he has of life and philosophy, it seems to extend also into various domains, such as potentially a more existentialist, positive level psychology, and also somewhat psychoanalytic with connections to Jung. So I think, at least from what I've heard from his lectures, a lot of his suggestions to his clients were very practical, right? They were like very behavior modifications. Change this about your life. But then when it comes to his emotional and meaningful reactions to society and to men in particular, when he's talking about caring for men who seem hopeless and in despair, and he's offering these advice on what constitutes meaning itself, it feels like he's extending and pushing beyond behaviorism and its practices and moving into something that's much more existential and almost like existential psychology and positive psychology. My first degree in psychology came from a behaviorist institution, so it was strict, like, okay, measure this behavior, move this thing, change this thing. But we talked about treating drugs. How you treat drugs is basically you poison the drug to make the person sick, so you develop this negative association with the drug. You don't talk about their mother, their father, all these things, right? Like you don't care about those things, right? We're not focused on what meaning or escape you're trying to have with the drug, right? We're just trying to say this behavior is bad for you, so we're going to build I guess we're going to condition you to have a negative association with this element, and so we're going to push you away from it by making it poison you, make you feel sick. Those are my initial reactions. What about you and your
I think that's all fair. I would agree. He definitely is not a strict behavioralist. And I hadn't kind of thought of that dichotomy as much about when it comes to, like you said, I like the way you could put it, like when it comes to reactions, he's not really behavioralist. He's more of, that's when you kind of bring up the more psychoanalytic perspective and you start thinking about the way you're thinking. And I think that's definitely true because I've done his self-authoring program, and I mean, that pretty much is what that is. It's kind of like, all right, because I think it's kind of the assumption with that one is like, all right, you've gotten to a level of desire to improve yourself where you're willing to sit down and do like a writing program. So you obviously don't have too many things catastrophically wrong in your life, or else you'd probably be more concerned with that than sitting down and doing a writing program. So in cases like that where you have your life decently put together, I think, I would agree with you that he does then kind of pivot more to, all right, if you really want to get to if you want to improve yourself to an even higher degree, you're going to have to look more at your own thought processes. Kind of this idea of like, once you get the basic building blocks in place, you can kind of deal with higher level concepts because you're not, worried about the floor collapsing because you haven't got the strong base. One of the kind of rules that stood out to me, getting to the actual material in the book, is Rule 8 kind of intrigued me on this one. So tell the truth or at least don't lie. Because I think this, still on this topic, I think it forms an interesting... It's an interesting line because, again, he doesn't just say tell the truth. He says tell the truth or at least don't lie. And I do think those are different things. I think they're different in kind of an important way of don't lie kind of falls more into that kind of behavioralist model of like, you just got to catch yourself whenever you're about to say something that you know is untrue, stop yourself, right? It's kind of a simple thing. Obviously, it's difficult. I think everyone would agree. But there are definitely times and incentives where you want to lie. But telling the truth raises that to a new level because it adds almost like not necessarily aspirational, but an ideological level almost of like, truth is an ideal, right? Honesty is a virtue, but truth itself is kind of this ideal thing. And whenever you're aiming at an ideal, that requires an entirely new level of thinking about yourself and thinking about your relations, thinking about your relation to your own actions, thinking about your relation to other people, there's all kinds of other things tied in there. So I kind of want to know your thoughts. What do you think that's kind of a fair breakdown of that? Do you think I'm splitting hairs with saying like those really are different? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think your commentary is a meaningful distinction and a good point on his chapter and what he's trying to get at there. That there's a difference between being able to tell the truth and just avoid lying. It seems like the ideal would be hopefully telling the truth, because on some level, I think to put it in his context, when you not only speak but embody the truth, and he seems to really want both, right? Like both speaking and embodying the truth, you're also standing against something else that's trying to lie to you, too. I think he knows that it's not always an option for us to fight every instance of what we think is a lie, right? Speaking the truth is one thing, but then not necessarily being in opposition, speaking the truth, is different from just choosing not to lie, not to go along with something that's bad. So it's like, I think one might be a more aggressive way of trying to assert this is what the truth of reality is, and the other one, don't lie, is just don't cooperate with something that's evil. You don't have to fight every battle, but like don't cooperate with it, and don't let your life become a lie, something that weakens you. Is that kind of connecting with?
Yeah, I think that pretty much vibes what I'm saying. So
yeah,
because I think it's also, I think there has to be some admission too that, like, kind of like you said, when you tell the truth, it almost implies this almost aggressive level of attacking other untruths. Mm-hmm. And I think that's very difficult, especially in kind of the modern world, mm-hmm. where it can be. There's a certain danger in too readily attacking basic foundations kind of society in terms of, the structures that make it up, and there's a lot of different senses you can take that, the things that make up a society. And the thing with truth is it's a very powerful disinfectant, and it kind of, truth burns away things that aren't true. And there's almost a danger in that in a complex society, because you don't want to start smashing the foundations of your own house without a readily available way to, patch it up very quickly. So that kind of, I think, does lead into the at least don't lie aspect of that as well of, it's not, we don't live in simple times anymore. The ancient Persians talked about how all you needed in a, young boy's education was you needed to teach him how to ride a horse, how to shoot a bow, and tell the truth. Those are far simpler times, though, when telling the truth can completely destabilize a society if it's built on certain lies. Mm-hmm. There has to be a certain level of acknowledgement that the greater evil sometimes would be the destruction caused by completely undermining things. Mm-hmm. So sometimes the prudent decision is to say, okay, well, I'm not going to affirm an untruth, but mm-hmm. perhaps for this situation, it is better to at least not directly address it, lest I cause damage. So, I think it's interesting. So, moving on again, so continuing with the actual rules, the kind of the meat of the book. First question I have related to the 12 ones. Are there any that you think are overly aspirational?
I think there are 4 in particular that I really enjoy about his book.
Okay.
And there's one of those I think that is potentially over aspirational. So I think the 4 are going to be Rule 6 through 10. Rule 6, set your house in perfect order before you criticize the world. Rule 7, pursue what is meaningful, not as expedient. Mm-hmm. Rule 8, like we just mentioned, tell the truth or at least don't lie. Rule number 9, assume that the person you're listening to might know something you don't. And I think rule number 10, be precise in your speech. And I think that rule number 10 for me applies back to rule number 6. So in chapter 6, what I was gathering from it was that he was saying, set your house in perfect order before you criticize the world. That came across as a little bit too ideal for me, the perfect order portion of it.
It is very interesting, that language, perfect order.
Yeah.
The fact he chooses that, because it's almost, there almost seems to be an implication there of don't criticize the world, because if your standard for criticizing the world is put your own house in perfect order, well, then you're just never going to reach that. But at the same time, I don't think he means that, because, you know, he's discussed it many times of like, no, I'm not saying do not, like, you can't criticize things. He's kind of talked about a similar train of thought to what we were just discussing, in that you should sometimes be a bit reticent to break things because you do that in your own peril. But at the same time, yeah, like I said, you some things are very much worthy of criticism in the world. I mean, obviously he does that himself. He's talked about this many times of like, yeah, my house is in perfect order. I'm a public speaker, though. You know, I'm a public figure, and he's often criticizing the world. So it almost does seem to be, you know, kind of a violation of Rule 10 of he's not being very precise in exactly what he means. But yeah, do you have more thoughts on that with the...
Yeah, I agree with you. I think I agree with the essence of what Peterson is saying. I was potentially disagreeing on the verbiage of perfect order.
Yes.
But I think the essence is so important for what it means to begin to criticize something or the world. In the first place, I mean, I'm just going to mirror some what Peterson said as well as just add my own perspective of it. In the first place, if your life is not in order, you don't know what to criticize about the world, because you don't know the difference between what's something that's wrong with you and something that's wrong with the world.
It's very true.
In the second place, if you don't have your life in order, you don't know how to fix the world. All you're going to do is add your own brokenness, your own mistakes to the world. And because you haven't fixed yourself, you're going to make the world worse. I think there's a sense in which people don't realize that their own imperfections can contaminate a system, especially if they're not going to take responsible for their own behavior, and they're the only ones who can. If they don't choose to take responsibility, that means someone else in society has to pick up the slack for them for what they're contributing to society, and that just creates more of a broken system.
100%. Because kind of a short, small, quick story real quick. You know, I think one of the reasons I do find Peterson so refreshing is because he's a clinical psychologist that really knows what he's doing. I mean, when you listen to his stories of how, you know, some of his client stories, those are the ones I find the most interesting, because you can obviously tell he thought deeply about the problems in front of him with these patients. And, you know, some of his solutions are very creative and very, you know, not the things you'd think of off the cuff, right? Mm-hmm. Like, they involve deep analysis of the problem and possible solutions and many contingencies on other things besides. And the reason I kind of find that refreshing is because, you know, when I was going through school, again, getting a psychology degree, in my school, my school had a very large counseling program as well. I think you could get an actual bachelor's in counseling, something like that. And obviously there was a lot of overlap between classes. Like, you would take a lot of psychology classes for a course like that, or a program like that. And so I had a lot of classes with counseling students. And I noticed a trend. Not saying it was all of them. Again, not all. But there was a very particular type of person that was attracted to said counseling program. And to be blunt, it was a lot of middle-aged women that when you asked them why they were in the counseling program, it was usually some variation of, well, I've struggled with mental health my entire life, and I want to be someone to, you know, help other people struggle with mental health. It's like, you know, noble aspirations, right? Mm-hmm. But it kind of goes to what you were just talking about of, you look at some of these people and you're like, are you really the person that should be helping someone else with their mental health? Mm-hmm. It's like, you just told me that, you know, you still struggle with anxiety and depression, and name a condition. I probably met someone in that program that struggled with it. Mm-hmm. It's like, I'm not saying that you're not a good person or you couldn't help people in some ways, but you're not you haven't organized yourself yet to the degree really where you're of use to someone else. Mm-hmm. To put it bluntly, like, you have to have that kind of internal order before you would help someone else in cases like that. And yeah, it applies to basically every domain. Mm-hmm. I'm coming more and more to the realization that the world is ordered off of strong ordered cores of things. You know, it's kind of like what makes a strong society in terms of like a nation? Well, you need strong family units. You can go back and forth. Does it have to be a nuclear family? Can you have more extended? It doesn't matter. But it's built on those very sentimental bonds of personal attachment between families. That's what builds a larger society. And it's true for so many other things as well. You have to have those strong cores of things that then can be the independent building blocks to build something else.
Yeah, you have to have a strong foundation.
Yeah.
I recently, just this last spring, completed a narrative trauma care level 1 certificate through the Allender Center up in Washington State. It was an online program, and we met for several hours together, diving into intense stories of trauma with various people, including stories of our own. One of the themes that Dan Allender, the psychologist, the main psychologist there, has advertised and promoted is that you can only take people as far as you yourself have gone, especially when it comes to counseling. That you can only take people as far as you yourself have gone. What that means for him is a very similar principle to what Peterson is advocating here, which is that if you are going to help people in mental health or other aspects of the world, you need to have done the work to process and become healthy yourself. Because if you have not, you're not going to be able to help other people in the way you want to. You need to first take responsibility for yourself, help yourself grow, do the hard work, process a lot of the mental illness or otherwise traumatic experiences that you've had in your life, and then from there you can be a positive force in other people's lives. If there's too many people wanting to fix things and they haven't fixed themselves, they're not going to know how to fix the world. Like you said, there needs to be a strong foundation, and it needs to be a healthy foundation to build other stronger things.
Completely agree. I'm just kind of looking at some of the other ones you talked about. It is interesting how you kind of clump together the I don't even, what would you describe those 5 or 6 rules, 4 or 5, I don't know, however many it was that you just talked about? Because there does seem to be a jump. Because the first one, stand up straight with your shoulders back. Very behavioralist, right? Do this thing, it'll have an impact on you. Treat yourself like someone you are responsible for helping. Kind of the same vein. Maybe a little bit more to that. Make friends with people who want the best. Again, they're all kind of simple in that regard. And then there does seem to be a shift. Especially, I think Rule 7 especially. Pursue what is meaningful, not what is expedient. It sounds as simple as some of the other ones, but I think we both know that it's not. Because it requires you to know what's meaningful.
Yeah,
that is not a simple question.
Yeah, I think the like you're saying, that's a good observation that I did not pick up on before. The first several rules seem to be more behavior modification and change you want to introduce to affect your life. And those are important. When I start to enter into Rule 6 and above, I start to get the theme of responsibility in particular.
Yeah.
Someone growing in responsibility for their own life, especially in Rule 7, maybe part of the peak of the responsibility that he's talking about there is delaying gratification for something that's more meaningful in the long run instead of choosing something that's more expedient or more proximate in the short term, something that's going to come at the expense of the future, as well as what's meaningful to you in the future. I think those rules, 6 through 10, at least for me, create a tight theme of responsibility. And that's one of the reasons I like them so much, is because they seem to... Rule 10 is a bit behaviorist, you could say, I guess.
Yeah, I think you could go either way, but it's still... 6, 7, and 8 especially, because kind of the thing I'm just looking at these now, the thing with 6, 7, and 8 is in order to do these, for 6, you need to know what order is. For 7, you need to know what meaningful is. And for 8, you need to know what truth is. And books have been filled trying to define those terms individually, let alone all 3 of them together. So, this is a monumental task in of itself. Rule 9 is interesting, but I think let's get into Rule 9 here in a little bit. I've got some other things I want to say to that. But at 10, I think it's the lightest of these 5 in that regard of the level of burden responsibility it's asking. But be precise. Precise is still not the easiest thing to always define as well. And specifically, this is one of my favorite stories he tells. I believe it's in this rule. If it's not, it's definitely applies to this one as well. The kind of the Marduk story that he always talks about, which, it's interesting. Pagan god, but I do think there's definitely still, we've talked about this before, there definitely still is wisdom in the old pagan religions. It could be an entire other discussion. We have some other point. But, this idea of Marduk being this god who's, he's got a head surrounded with eyes and he speaks magic words. So he pays attention to the world and then he orders his words properly. And that's kind of, this idea that is the height of wisdom. Paying attention to the world and then ordering your words properly. So I think if you look at Rule 10 from that perspective, like that is the aspirational goal, pay attention to the world and order your words properly, I think it definitely fits with the rest of these and being like, that is not easy.
Yeah.
That is extremely difficult standard to live up to.
That makes sense, yeah.
And then 11 and 12 kind of fall back into the theme of 1 through 5, but it's a funny one to end on. Pet a cat when you encounter one on the street. But
yeah. Don't take for granted the small things, Yeah, I do like your categorization and separation out in the rules, and I think there is like a tone shift. Definitely that's there. Along with like Rule 10, I can see how it's connected somewhat to Rule 8. Maybe not entirely, but at least somewhat there's the connection there.
Yeah.
Because at least one of my personal philosophies, I know not everyone has this because there is a persuasive element to hyperbole. One of my personal philosophies in reflection on Peterson is try not to exaggerate. Like as far as I understand, a lot of people enter into more depressed states because they exaggerate the negative aspects about their lives in different ways. And people become overly angry because they also exaggerate the bad things that happen to them. There's a sense in which people, through chronic exaggeration, begin to build up and dramatize and begin to believe a slight lie that they tell about the reality in their own experiences. And I think a lot of more bigger lies that people believe and don't realize they believe can be built up by chronic and habitual senses of exaggerated responses to things.
It can even be lethal. Have you ever heard the story of the Vietnam POWs?
I know.
Okay, so this we can do this real quick. So I believe it was Admiral Stockdale that told this story, but Vice Admiral Stockdale, the famous Vietnam War hero, got the Medal of Honor. He was in the Hanoi Hilton, the infamous Viet Cong prison camp for American POWs, pilots in particular. But he noted something very interesting, and that was that it was the optimist that died first in the POW camps. And he had a very particular definition of what he meant by optimist. And by what he meant by optimist were the people that were constantly saying, like, oh, we'll be rescued by next Christmas. Whereas the realists, or the kind of pragmatists he put it, were the ones that had the highest successful rate, or like survival rates. And when we mean die, I mean literally people were, dying of just, they gave up on life. Such terrible conditions, it was... the actual will to live was important in your survival. And the reason he gave for that is because the people that were saying, oh, we'll be rescued by next Christmas, well, then Christmas would roll around, they didn't get rescued. And it almost is a little lie they told about the world of like, it will be this way, and then their expectations crash and it destroys part of themselves. And, it might not matter on small things in our lives, but when you're literally relying on your will to live, it can literally kill you. And that's what it did. He saw so many of those guys that would come in, they would only last a few months because they were under these horrendous conditions. They're like, oh, we'll get rescued by this next holiday or this next date that they create in their mind. It breaks, they die. Whereas the pragmatist would still kind of be an optimist in the kind of the colloquial sense of it, where they'd be like, we will get rescued. But it was more of just kind of this statement of faith of, we will eventually make it out of here, not tying it to a specific contingent outcome, like a specific, certain conditions had to specifically be met in order to do it. They just had conditions that had genuinely be met, because that way, it was never not the case, Till literally they died and it didn't matter. But up till that point, it could be done in the future. I think there is some wisdom in understanding those two different mindsets and why one has such serious flaws and the other, it kind of going to Rule 7, it might feel more expedient to be like, oh, we'll be out of here by Christmas. Especially if it happens, If you randomly guess the actual reality of things, you're going to feel great. But if you're wrong, it can be catastrophic.
Yeah, that makes sense. And it feels like it applies in so many different principles of relational examples of, for example, married couples.
Yeah.
There can be tensions that escalate, not because the actual behaviors escalate or change, but because the narrative we tell ourselves about those behaviors changes. Like, for example, if one of the partners doesn't take out the trash when the other one wants them to, the narrative that can begin to generate is an exaggeration, which is this person never takes out the trash. That will begin to form like a more negative, intense attitude over time that creates this absolute narrative, which is an exaggeration. It's not true, right? Towards the other person that's intrinsically hostile, instead of, oh, they forgot this time, and this is like the third time in a row sort of thing. And those are different things, different attitudes.
So, going to move things along to next topic. There's a couple things I still want to cover. Let's go back now real quick to... Actually, let's do our favorite rules real quick, and then we can kind of end out on that last topic I have. So, I briefly mentioned it. So, Rule 9. I find Rule 9 fascinating. This is definitely my favorite rule, at least in this book. So, assume that the person you're listening to might know something you don't. I just find this one absolutely profound, and it's extremely true. It's this idea of of humility, of like, you are bounded in your knowledge of the world. When you come into conflict with someone, there might be a very legitimate reason for that you simply don't know. And it does, this mindset I've found when I remember to apply it, it leads to so many more amazing kind of revelations about the world. It is fascinating. If you this was one I think that if you truly do manage to apply in your life, I think if you truly manage to apply any of these rules in your life, you will find improvement. Because I don't think any of us live up to any of them 100% of the time.
Oh yeah.
But this is one I think that is great in that regard. Of it will truly change your life because the decisions you make in your life fundamentally come down to your understanding of the world. Like, you cannot make a decision outside the bounds of your understanding. It's just literally impossible. So if you're orienting yourself in a way that constantly expands that understanding of the world, that has that humility to be like, I'm going to truly listen to other people. And listen doesn't even just mean listen. It also means observe, understand. It allows you to then slowly increase the quality of the decisions that you make because, you're able to orient yourself better. You're not under illusions about the world. So that's why that one's by far my favorite.
That one is valuable. It's like, on one level, I can hear you saying that there are people who have different perspectives and experiences, many of which I just cannot have for myself.
Yeah.
Throughout the world. Different people who have expertise in different fields, as well as people who have seen and known things that other people can't. And that's part of the power of testimony itself. Someone else was there to experience something that I wasn't. And you just have to, at some level, trust them and be open to them, or else you just cannot trust anything. That we have to rely on testimony. I think there's like an implicit principle that's also there, which is that whenever you're engaging in discussions with people and you seem to disagree, or you think that what they're doing is wrong, whatever that is, I think there's there's a way in which we can respond to their instinctive desire for something good and valuable and important. For example, if someone is doing something wrong, a murderer is like wanting to kill someone, there's something good about that they want, right? Like they want like maybe vengeance, for example. Maybe they want to have a sense of high for themselves, so they're like more antisocial on some dimension. Maybe they take pleasure in it, but it's still the pleasure that they're wanting most, right? There's something good about even the worst actions. And if we can find a way to know what it is, whatever the good that the other person wants is, and be able to integrate and incorporate that into the discussion to find a better way for them to get some level of that goodness, but in a way that's less destructive, that can also be really beneficial.
Yeah, but he's put it another way. I think everyone wants, fundamentally, every human wants an ordered and coherent world from their perspective. Obviously from their perspective. To be honest, you can order and structured world only makes sense from an individual perspective. You can have multiple individual perspectives from a similar perspective, and then say the larger society is ordered and coherent. But really, that is it's such a subjective perspective that it only makes sense from the personal. So yeah, I agree with you. Like, look at other people and understand, well, how do their actions make sense, not from necessarily their ordered perspective world, but from the perspective they're trying to create an ordered perspective world.
Yeah.
So, yeah. If you can figure that out, like how are there, you can make even psychopaths and, schizophrenics and other people make sense because, they're just trying to put their world in a way that's coherent. Even if their inputs are completely incoherent, but yeah.
Yeah.
So what would you say your favorite is, though, of the 12?
I love Rule 8, actually.
Rule 8, yeah.
Yeah. Rule 7 is the one I have signed by Peterson in my poster in my room, but Rule 8 is my favorite, mainly because I feel like there's the instant, or the situation of lying, and I've thought a lot about lying and what it is, and its attempt to control others by manipulating the perspective of reality in order to thwart their ability to authentically and freely respond to reality and make choices for their own. There's different thoughts that I have on what it is to control and how lies play a part of that control. Different things that are related to Stoic thoughts. For example, I just write down different thoughts at times that I have them. One of them is this: the more you need your environment to change, the more your needs are under something else's control. So when you're trying to...
Yeah, I agree.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. It's the more you try to control your environment through lies, and I think lies are implicitly an attempt to control something because you're not trusting reality to respond to you in an authentic way back in the way that you want it to. I think that you're trying to control things. Another one is when we control a situation, we become entangled with it. In effect, we no longer control it, but its outcome controls us. It is better to struggle to accept something than to struggle by not accepting it. And I think lies are generally a struggle to not accept something, such as that someone else is going to choose something that we don't want them to.
Yeah.
There's other things. For example, I think lies are intrinsically opposed to caring for someone. I think that you cannot control someone and love them at the same time, because when you do control them, you're only loving yourself through them. So I think control in relationships is a major struggle. As well as when we're under a lie, we are not free to respond authentically to reality. But the most important lies are acted out rather than said, at least in my opinion. Behavior asserts propositions about dignity and freedom more persuasively than words. So I think how we choose to treat people and the lies that we can tell by from our behaviors, not just our words, are things that deeply assault the dignity of other persons sometimes. But yeah.
It is interesting. Something you said a second ago was, a lie is an attempt to deny something. Mm-hmm. I think that is very true because, you can ask, kind of what is a lie? And someone might say, well, it's an untruth. Well, it's really not sufficient because a lie is not just an untruth. It's a sufficient untruth. Like if someone says something that's incorrect unknowingly, we don't really say that's a lie. Mm-hmm. They're just mistaken. Because usually the assumption is if they were told the truth, they'd correct themselves. So there is that aspect of open denial in lying. Of you're not only saying an untruth, but you're looking at the truth and specifically rejecting it.
Yes,
and that is a very, very intentional act. Mm-hmm. And I agree with you that it can seem sometimes, and we talked a little bit about this earlier, there might be times that untruths, or at least not addressing the truth, might have benefits. There might even be times that small lies have benefits, but it's always going to be the lesser of evils. If there's ever a time that lying is justified, it is because of the lesser of evils, not because it in itself is an inherent good. So it's an interesting topic. But last topic that I want to get onto before we can kind of close out on, you can kind of summarize everything, and I'll ask my questions kind of up front, and then we can just kind of a free-form discussion to the close. So, the book is subtitled An Antidote to Chaos. And this is a theme that Peterson talks about a lot. Something you'll hear come up a lot in his lectures and his other talks is order and chaos. So first question is kind of, what is your thoughts on that dichotomy? You think it represents something meaningful? Is it a good way to view the world? And then the follow-on to that is, if so, do you think these rules are sufficient to build an ordered life? You know, is it the antidote to chaos? He promises, and then the final one to that is, if you don't think it's sufficient, what should we add to this? And if you do think it's sufficient, what else would be beneficial? Because it might be sufficient, but there might be something else you'd say, add this as well. It would help, but
yeah, I think order and chaos are interesting terms that also feel somewhat vague to me. Like, in the sense I know what they mean. Like, for example, societally, order and chaos are probably the difference between a somewhat peaceful neighborhood and a chaotic, riotous one. Maybe what they mean at the level that Peterson is offering is interesting. It seems like he wants to say that chaos, I don't know, it has some level of potentiality to it, and order is structure on some level where that potentiality is settled into something. It's like become something, and there's a way in which things are predictable.
Yeah, I think there's also a level of like sterility and virility to it. Of like order's sterile, it's predictable, whereas chaos, there's kind of that, it's got that potential to produce new and novel forms.
Yeah.
Yeah, if you want to continue.
Yeah, I mean, those are like initial thoughts. I know, like, in development for children psychologically, when their environment is too unpredictable, too chaotic, their psyches cannot handle that. Like, that's when you generally see the rise of what you will call different attachment disorders, such as called the disorganized attachment, a chaotic attachment, where the child has both a draw towards their parent figure and a pushing away of the parent figure. And they often, left untreated, can maintain this throughout their lives and their relationships and create a very confusing context for the people around them. A constant push and pull towards people, and people explain these relationships as very confusing, chaotic, and not knowing what's going on. Also, you see these children coming up with a lack of structure, a lack of order, being in a state of chronic anxiety, sometimes depression. Sometimes, if there's so much order that there's not enough freedom for them, they'll end up growing up in an environment very depressive. Mm-hmm. Like, they won't have the freedom they won't have their chaos fully integrated in the system so that the order can handle their chaos in the system. Instead, it crushes or suppresses it. In that case, they also become much more depressive, maybe not as anxious, but more just like depressive in general, more repressed, resulting in like a sort of subconscious chaos and drugs and other things like that. But yeah, those are some initial thoughts.
I think some of his best work on this is actually in his Exodus lectures, or I guess those aren't really lectures, the Exodus talks that he did that are on YouTube, because he really talks well in that one about, I think you can talk about the extremes of order and chaos, right? Because if you have them perfectly balanced, it's not an issue. It's when you have too much of one or too much of the other that it becomes a problem. So it's kind of like excess order and excess chaos is when things get problematic. Again, if you have them perfectly balanced, no one cares, because that's the ideal, that's the perfection. But of course, that never happens. You always have too much of one or the other. And I think he really talks about in Exodus, that's a story that really highlights the dangers of both extremes, because the tyranny under the Pharaoh is an excess of order. It's that tyrannical order of everything's perfectly structured, but it is that repressive order of you know exactly what you're going to get, but it's out of line with what you want. Mm-hmm. And I think some of that's inevitability. Like, you're never going to be able to perfectly model the world around you to your ideals and how you want it. But if it's so out of whack that, again, it feels repressive, that's a serious problem. Mm-hmm. And eventually you're going to have to break that down. And that's when the flood of chaos is going to come in. Mm-hmm. And the chaos in that case is the desert. And the desert in the Exodus story is tyrannical chaos. And, it's been pointed out by many people, it says the Israelites wandered in the desert for 40 years. Well, there's no desert in that region big enough for an entire tribe of people to wander around in 40 years. So there's obviously something psychological to the story beyond just the physical, they wandered in the desert. And, what Peterson will argue, it's the desert represents that tyrannical chaos, that excess, because they went from a place of excess order to suddenly they broke all the order, and now societally they're in chaos because that you don't know what to predict. And I think fundamentally the issue with too much chaos is, like we just said, too much order. It's you lead to a scenario where there is too much of a disconnect between how the world is and how you want the world, and because order limits the availability of your options, you're not able to reconcile that difference, and so you're just stuck with that perpetual separation. And so eventually you had to break the order itself to get those closer together. Mm-hmm. The issue with too much chaos is there's nothing stopping you from taking the world as it is and creating a world as you want it to be. Literally, there's literally nothing stopping. That's the point. Like, it's purely chaotic. There's nothing oppressing you necessarily, mm-hmm. in the terms of, like, literally something pressing down on you. But where the problem emerges there is the desert. The desert requires so much psychological energy to constantly be processing what to do. You get oppressed by kind of paralysis of your own mind. You need some kind of guardrails, or else you're going to expend infinite energy processing infinite possibilities, mm-hmm. and that's just not sustainable for a finite being. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of the two extremes. I do think it is really comes down to that psychological perspective of each one has issues in the extreme. So we need a balance of the two, where we need a world in which it's malleable enough that we can bring it closer to our ideal, mm-hmm. but limited enough that we're not having to process infinite possibilities, because that just destroys us.
Yeah, that makes sense. There needs to be enough structure to know that the needs that you have will be met predictably, because if that's not the case, then you have some panicking to do to find a new source for those needs.
That's probably the best way to put it. You need to know that your needs will be met predictably, because mm-hmm. if you predictably know your needs will not going to be met, mm-hmm. well, that's a tyranny of order. Mm-hmm. That's bad. Yeah. But if you also unpredictably know that your needs are going to be met, that's a too much order, and it leads to that same process of death by paralysis of computation, of just you can't handle a world like that. So.
Yeah.
But yeah, that just finally summarize of kind of answer that question. Do you think these are sufficient? Is there anything else you would add?
I think his books contain so much material that there's a lot to discuss on it.
It really is.
I think we've done a good job with hitting a lot of highlights. And you have a lot of great questions for this podcast for it too, just to make the discussion. I think that's most of my thoughts for this one. Again, I love Rule 8. I love Rules 6 through 10 in particular. I think all the book is wonderful. And there's a lot that I can learn. I think society can learn from this. I don't really have any other thoughts to offer before closing out. Do you have anything? Or?
Yeah, not really. Probably a testament. I really tried to think about something I would add in terms of something for, an antidote to chaos. Because, of course, the next one, which we'll be talking about, and we might spend more time on the actual book now that we've covered more of Peterson generally as a person. The next one is marketed as, I forget what his term for it is, but this one's for too much chaos, the next one's for too much order. So, yeah, but in terms of this topic of another way to address the chaos, none come to mind. If I ever do think about one, we can talk about it later. I might add it to the next one as an intro if I do think about one. But yeah, nothing particular comes to mind, which again is probably just a testament to how well he put these together. Because I think he's talked about before, he originally did this in a Quora article or something.
Yeah.
And he had 48 rules or something, and he narrowed them down for this publication and stuff. So I think there's a lot of refinement that went into, getting rid of duplicates and stuff that say the same thing. But I don't know. I haven't looked into that process enough. But
yeah, I think he has all the essential elements for building an ordered life here. At least all that I can think of right now.
Yeah. But yeah, I think that's that. So we covered everything substantive. You kind of did our shilling at the beginning. Anything else you want to add?
That's pretty much everything I have written down. I guess the next step is considering the chaos and the next thing.
Yeah.
One thought that I have in almost transitioning between the books is I think there's a difference between trying to control the world and accepting control from the world. And I think neither is good. And so in transitioning to the next book that we would talk about, I would offer the thought to accept being controlled means demeaning yourself to the level of a tool and dismissing your own needs and hopes. So I think in terms of transitioning to our trying not to control the world, also not accepting the world controls in some level too. That would be some of my thoughts.
Yeah, that is an interest. I agree with you. Leads to an interesting. The first thing that pops in my head is discussion about kind of like free will and kind of like the Calvinist perspective on predestination and other stuff. But that is completely off topic. So we'll leave the Calvinist bashing for another time. We might come back, and I think there's a few times I've said that so far of other possibilities in the future. So if this is popular, if people like this, let us know. So. It's our first time doing a podcast like this, so if you guys got any suggestions, put in the comments. Please share it with us. Let us know. I'll be putting a snippet of this on my channel, and the main one will go on Ryan's. But for the next one, we'll flip that. If you're hearing this on his channel, please visit mine. If you're hearing this on my channel, go over to his. Get the full thing.
Again, that's In Search of Prometheus for Thomas. Yep. And Intending Truth for Ryan.
Yeah. And everything will be linked down below. So, yeah, enjoy